Hello, my name is Robert Phillips and I work with Tour Charleston. And I've been giving tours of our fair city for about 30 years. And what we like to do is share a little of our 343-year history with you. How did Charleston come to be? We got to look back to grateful King Charles II. You might remember his father, Charles I. I like to say he gave meaning to the term heads were rolled. He was beheaded. So his son wondered whether he would ever become king. Well, it finally happened in 1660, and it came about from 8 gentlemen, and he had to pay them back, but he didn't have the money, so he paid them in land. And what they called Carolina, today we call North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, parts of Florida, and all points westward from the Atlantic to the Pacific. I always like to say he was very grateful. We're in front of Rainbow Road. We have a group of pre-Revolutionary war homes extending from Elliott to Tradd Street. Now, when these were first built, roughly in the mid-1700s, they had their businesses downstairs and they lived upstairs, and across the street there would have been wharves, so docks, where the ships would dock, unload, and transfer the merchandise over here to these buildings. Now, they fell into disrepair over the years, and in the early 1900s, Mrs. Legg, despite everybody telling her not to, bought one of these homes and began to restore it, and she kind of inspired the restoration of the area that we know as Rainbow Road today. We're here in front of the old exchange. Many things have happened here, but probably one of the more popular and interesting was the Charleston Tea Party. Everyone's heard of the Boston Tea Party, but Charleston had their own. In December of 1773, they gathered here to protest the tea just like those folks in Boston, but contrary to the Bostonians, they did not throw the tea in the harbor. They forced the tea to be unloaded, stored in this building, and then when they needed money for the war effort later in the war, they sold the tea and used that money to finance the war against the very people that had tried to tax them. Now, there's a lot more stories to this building, but you're going to have to come here to Charleston and take the tour to hear more of them. As you walk through the city of Charleston, you'll find a variety of architectural styles, but there's one basic format upon which these styles are placed, and that is the single house. And we have a good example across the street there at 51 East Bay. Now, a single house has the narrow end to the street, the length projecting back into the lot. 1 room wide, 2 rooms deep. Now, there's a lot of stories of why that happened, but the main thing is for breezes. It allows each room access to the breezes. And if you spend any time in Charleston, you know trying to stay cool is a #1 effort. The door fronting the street is for privacy. It's called a street door. It leads onto the porch, which we call piazza. If you said porch, it just wouldn't have the same impact. So the single house, the major format that you see throughout the city. One of the major disasters that have hit Charleston was the earthquake of 1886. They do not know the magnitude because the Richter scale was not in place, but many believe that it was somewhere around 7.3, 7.4. And just about every building in the city was damaged in some sense. Now, this was not long after the Civil War, so they didn't have the money to tear down and build anew, so they had to make do with what they had. And one way was to put in earthquake bolts. And if you look back over my shoulder here, you see these X's on this building. These are earthquake bolts. There's a rod fastened by a nut, and that rod goes through the building, and in the middle there's a turnbuckle. And the idea was to literally screw the buildings back together to repair the damages of that earthquake. Does nothing to prevent earthquake damage, and that's something to consider since we do have tremors ever so often. We're standing in front of Longitude Lane. Now, Longitude Lane really should be called Latitude Lane since it runs east and west, but nevertheless, this is one of the more important areas in the city because this is where rice was introduced, or one of the stories with the introduction of rice. According to legend, a ship's captain from Madagascar brought a bag of rice, gave it to a local who planted it here. From the seed of that original planting, he distributed to others and allowed Charleston to grow rice, leading it to become the wealthiest city in colonial America. All right, we're standing on the promenade of the Battery, the stretch of antebellum homes you'll see here. To my right here is the Edmonston Alston House, early 1800s vintage. This was where Pierre Gustave Toutant Beauregard stood during the bombing of Fort Sumter. He was a Confederate commander. And Fort Sumter is probably the episode most people have heard about in connection to Charleston. The start of the Civil War in April of 1861. The first shots rang out. April April 11th, 1861. Roughly 34 hours of bombing, nobody was killed. The first casualties come during the surrender, as they were lowering the flag to a cannon salute. One of the cannons misfired, and some poor guy standing nearby had his arm torn off and died initially, right off. And another guy died a few days later. 4 years to the day, they have a ceremony, kind of a commemorative ending to the war. And they invite Lincoln to come back. And Major Anderson, the Union commander, is still around. He has the flag he wants to raise to kind of put an end to the whole turmoil event. They invite Lincoln, but Lincoln says, you know, I don't think I'm coming. My wife is kind of upset, and we're going to the theater instead. So instead of coming here, he goes to the Ford's Theater, and everybody knows what happens. And that's that big if. What if he had come here instead of Ford's Theater? History as we know it would have definitely been changed. We're here at the Battery, and you can see a collection of guns that represent the various wars that the city's been involved in. Many believe this is where they get the biggest charge out of the tour because of the Battery. But in the early days, this number of pirates were hanged out here, foremost being Stede Bonnet, the gentleman pirate. And today is just a nice area to come and relax and then kind of enjoy the city. So come and be a part of this. Be part of history. Feel history, see history, hear history. We're waiting on you. Come see us.